Chapter 19. I don't play with dolls, she repeated, loudly this time, too loudly for so small a space, in case they hadn't heard. The man doll nodded his smiling face. Then we must be remarkably alike, he said. I don't play with dolls. Every morning, in fact, the first thing I do is not play with dolls. Sometimes late into the day as well, he added, although by evening I am busy not doing other things, playing the violin, for instance, or shining shoes. Do you also not play the violin? Maggie looked from one doll to the other as they sat in their little chairs. What are you? She finally whispered. Not what, the man doll replied. How? You're supposed to say, how are you? No, I mean what? Who? Who are you? The man doll rose. I am Timothy John, he said. Stiffly, he bent from the waist, forming a right angle, at the same time offering Maggie his hand. And this is Miss Christabel. She is my wife. That's not what I mean, Maggie answered, ignoring the hand. I mean, what are you doing here? Doing here? But just a moment ago you were interested in what we weren't doing here, I must think. Well, Miss Christabel is collecting teacup splinters in her shoe, for one, and I am offering you my hand, but not to keep, mind you. I would like it back when you are through shaking it. But how come you look like that? Like what? Like that. You know, like whatever it is you're made of, china or something. That seems a strange question. Most people look at what they're made of. You do yourself. He continued to lean forward with his hand extended, and Maggie held her place at the window. Timothy John is waiting to shake your hand, the woman doll urged, but Maggie turned away. Outside, far, far below, two dark figures, small as crows, were picking their way across the snowy walk toward the house. Aunt Lillian and Aunt Harriet were returning from wherever they had gone, and in a moment they would be inside. Funny to think of them down there doing all their usual things, dusting and writing and gliding about on their silent wheels, while all the time she was up here, in this crazy place, in a secret room they knew nothing about, with two creatures they had never seen. A secret room. She turned back to study once more the little chairs and table and the kettle on the stove. It was like a house almost, like the make-believe house she had laid out with sticks on the grass under the birches, except this one had real furniture in it. And, how do you do, the man doll said now, his hand still reaching toward her. And people, sort of. A little house with furniture and people. She stared at the doll hand with its unseparated fingers and pink oval nails. What would it feel like, she wondered, warm and alive, like her own, or cold as a teacup? She put her hand out a short distance, but withdrew it. It was just a doll's hand, after all. It was stupid to shake hands with a doll. The two aunts were no longer on the front walk, only their footprints, like a caravan of insects, patterned the snow, and from somewhere she heard the muffled sound of a door slamming shut. Pretty soon they would begin to move around downstairs, snapping open the writing desk, snapping it shut, snapping open their mouths, snapping them shut, calling aloud, Maggie, your bed is unmade. Maggie, you have littered your room again. Maggie, your breakfast is untouched. Maggie this, Maggie that, wondering where she was, never guessing. When you have shaken Timothy John's hand, the woman doll persisted, you may get the broom. Maggie turned her eyes back to the little room, to the little house with people, with a mother and a father, sort of, and a dog, and three places at the table, one for her. She could be the little girl. The teacup is still at my foot, the woman doll added. The man doll peered under the table. Luckily, he said, there's still a great many places where the teacup is not. Yes, but my foot doesn't happen to be in any of them. Maggie took a deep breath and leaned down. Slowly, she put her arm out, drew it in, put it out again, and in a quick instant closed her fingers around the small china hand. It was cold and smooth as stone, and she pulled back as though she had touched a hot coal. Well, the woman doll exclaimed with a sigh that came, like the words she spoke, from somewhere inside her head. Now you belong. How very nice. Just sweep the china and the china bits and we can have our tea. No, I don't, Maggie said. I don't belong to anything. But she took a step forward and then another and another, and without looking at either doll, advanced to the little alcove where she seized the broom in one hand and the dustpan in the other, and in one swift movement swept the broken pieces into the pail. Ah, said Miss Christabel. Now there's a place for my foot to rest. Wasn't that nicely done, Timothy John? Now choose your cup. And Maggie, still not looking at either doll, examined the stack of cups until she found one with the same cluster of flowers that decorated the saucer at her place on the table. It has a crack, she said, thrusting it in front of the woman doll's face. Miss Christabel leaned over to peer at it. So it does, she agreed. And a nice one, too, like a little vine. Now, bring the kettle and mind your fingers. It will be hot. Maggie pressed her palm against the side of the kettle on the stove. It's cold, she said, cold as ice, and besides, she added, looking inside, it's empty, nothing's in it. She swung the kettle around her head and held it upside down. See? Look out! Both dolls cried at once. You'll spill. And Maggie jumped back, but nothing came out of the spout at all. Bring it to the table, Timothy John said, and hold it right side up. The water will stay inside better that way. There isn't any water, Maggie said, but she carried it right side up anyway and dropped it on the table. The teapot was empty too, she noticed, and so were the sugar bowl and the creamer. Fill the teapot now, Timothy John said. She remembered a myth or a fairy tale about an empty pitcher that poured wine or something every time it was tipped over a bowl. Maybe this kettle was magic like that. Maybe hot water would really bubble from its spout and tea leaves would spring to life in the teapot. With both hands, she tilted the kettle and watched expectantly, but nothing came out at all, and the teapot remained cold and empty. There's nothing in it, she shouted, slamming it on the table. Slowly, Miss Christabel cautioned. Don't splash the tablecloth. And don't forget the tea cozy, Timothy John added. The what? Maggie stared at him. Over here. And Timothy John nodded at the little crocheted hat on the table. Maggie turned it over in her hands a few times and finally pulled it over Miss Christabel's head. Mercy! Exclaimed Miss Christabel. On the teapot, Timothy John corrected, and Maggie crammed it on the empty china pot. A hat for a teapot? That will keep the heat inside, Miss Christabel explained. If the heat goes out, Timothy John added, it gets mixed up with the cold and nobody can find it. Oh, and the lid of the bread tin is stuck, Maggie, Miss Christabel said. See if you can pry it off. She pointed to the shelf over the stove. The bread box rattled when Maggie reached down, and she found 3 slabs inside. They're wood, she said, holding them up for the dolls to see. Bring them to the table, Timothy John said. Wooden bread. And Maggie dropped them one by one on the tablecloth with butter painted on. They belong on a plate, Miss Christabel corrected her, and overlap them so they won't fall off. The tea must be ready by now. I can smell it. And she brought her hands to her cup, holding it out for Maggie to fill. This is our best tea, Timothy John commented. Its vapors will put curls in your hair. Did you know that? And try the bread too. It will fatten your wrists. The 2 dolls raised their teacups and their bread to their lips. First one, then the other, and Maggie listened to the little clicks, china to china and china to wood. After a long while, she lifted her own teacup and sniffed at it. It doesn't have any vapor, she said, lowering it again. It doesn't smell at all. And after another long moment, she put the tip of her tongue to the wooden crust. It tastes like wood, she said, dropping it back to on the table, but quietly. Turning aside, she touched the hank of hair at her cheek, testing it, and she checked her lower arm. Her hair was stiff and moist like always, and her wrist remained thin and full of bones, like the neck of a chicken. Miss Christabel put her saucer next to the dog's basket, and he growled softly as a cat purrs. Have some tea, Juniper, she said, and then we will walk to the garden. It seems an especially nice day for the garden, doesn't it, Timothy John? Lovely, he answered. It's snowing, Maggie said. Not in the garden, Timothy John answered. Where is it? She asked. Where is it snowing? But you already know that. No, where is the garden? Ah, the garden. The garden is that place which is surrounded by everything that isn't garden. It is also where the roses grow. But first we must tidy up, Miss Christabel said, and she put everything where it had been when Maggie had first entered the room an age ago. Now then, Timothy John removed a small top hat from a hook on the wall and placed it on his head. Next he took up a little scrap of newspaper and hung a small cane over his jointed wrist. Garden time, he announced, and he picked Juniper up in his basket. Garden time, Miss Christabel repeated, and she slipped her arm through the handle of the kettle. Maggie said nothing at all, but followed the 2 dolls first with her eye, and then with shortened steps as they rounded the table and worked their way inch by inch to the end wall, around the far corner, along the narrow corridor towards what? Maggie couldn't tell, but she looked over her shoulder twice to memorize the way back to the room with the little table and chairs, the sofa with the dented pillows, and the teapot that held no tea.